Welcome back to the conversation at the Leaky Cauldron, episode 17, Lucky 17, my favorite number, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, chapters 5 through 10. Back with me are Miss Sarah Miller, bang, 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 and Mr. Wesley Schantz, ready to bring you back to Hogwarts today. Welcome back, you two.
Yo, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you doing, Sarah?
Good, thank you.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Well, so we had about 5 chapters this time around. In excess of Phlegm, Draco's Detour, the Slug Club, Snape Victorious, Half-Blood Prince, House of Gaunt. For one of a better, more creative starting point, do y'all want to start back at the Burrow and talking about this Phlegm? What is this Phlegm? I don't remember any Phlegm. I remember a Fleur Delacour and some new information about her, but Phlegm? What y'all think about this chapter?
Oh gosh, I'm going back to it now. I mean, the Phlegm isn't that Ginny's nickname that she comes up with, or is that something that one of the other Weasleys might have invented for her? I thought it was Ginny though, right?
I do recall her using that term. Yes.
Yeah, so it's cool. I mean, these are interesting chapters to read as a chunk. You've got the love potion when we have our first potions class, and then you have the kind of awful story of the House of Gaunt shortly after that. And so when you go back and look at it again, the excess of Phlegm chapter in the light of those two looks a little more sinister, actually, right? That you have this, kind of Romeo and Juliet type of thing, like maybe not that far, but a situation where Fleur is this outsider, and all the Weasleys, except Bill, of course, seem to be like upset by her presence there. I don't know, like that's kind of, it's kind of mean, of Ginny to call her that. I don't know, but on the other hand, she does present a real danger, a real threat to the stability of the greatest, wizarding family we've seen, basically, right?
Yeah, Sarah, what do you see in the relationship between Molly Weasley and Fleur and Ginny? Is there a jealousy going on, aspect going on? Is there they actually don't think she's a right fit for Bill, and this really is a quick decision thing going on? Is she just so overly critical and annoying that anybody would act like this? What did you think?
I mean, I'm not really sure I see her as a threat in the same way, or I'm not really sure what you mean by that, Wes. So on the one hand, I can understand how there would be a little bit of jealousy at, Mrs. Weasley and Ginny are, the two incredibly strong women in this very male household. And, you add a third, and it has the potential to upset the balance that they've like cultivated and figured out. I think what I can see Ginny being jealous of is like, and this is a foolish fear because very obviously her mother doesn't prefer Fleur to Ginny, but what if your mom starts to like the girl that your brother marries more than she likes you, right? I can see that being sort of maybe like a deep-seated issue. There's not a lot of text to support that. I think Fleur is just annoying, quite frankly. Ginny is right. Remember, she's like in her 5th year. She's grown up around some pretty strong personalities, and she seems to have taken after Fred and George in many ways. She's an aggressive Quidditch player, and I think her reaction to this is like just plain old immature. I think Phlegm or Fleur is annoying, but Ginny's not behaving in a way that is like the mature way to react to somebody who is annoying. I think she's also, like all girls would be, I think, a little bit sensitive to the fact that the boys just kind of like snap to around her. And there's like a hierarchy, like, well, what's so special about her? She's annoying. She's got a funny accent. She can't do anything. She's not helpful around the house. The only reason you like her is because she's pretty. And I can understand somebody like Ginny being a little angry about that, even though we know that Ginny herself is quite pretty and that she has other things going on for her, right? She's invited to the slug club because she's, dynamite at a certain kind of hex.
Bat bogey.
She's going to crush her Quidditch trials. She's bright, she's clever, she's sought after. I think that's sort of the vibe that I read, like why she's like annoyed by Fleur. It's almost not even Fleur's fault, right? It's actually like her annoyance is kind of the whole circumstance, right? That like, man, just like have like a 10 walks in the room and just there go all of the other, that's like the male agenda, the male attitude, the male gaze, like so all of these things that she's worked really hard to cultivate outside of her appearance, like what do they mean, right? And that's I think that definitely relates to Merope Gaunt and what we'll learn about her later. I think in these chapters there's just a lot of different kinds of romantic impulses, right? There's the cute Mrs. Weasley and Mr. Weasley. There's what we'll later find out is like pining for someone. There's a lot of references to dating. This seems to be, I've sort of listened and read ahead. It seems to be like kind of a theme that there's a lot of romance in this book. There's the amortensia, there's the love potions at the at Fred and George's shop. I think there's a lot of like impulses towards kinds of romance or different kinds of romantic relationships. And I don't know, that's sort of how I saw the phlegm. I think maybe just as a word, it's gross and would be something that she, as this perfect little French girl, would be like grossed out by, and that's kind of why Ginny picks it too. But I don't know.
I agree with all of that, and I think it's interesting too that the Weasleys, as beautiful as Fleur is, she is a hybrid, which would be looked down upon by purists like the Death Eaters. And I think part of the fact that Bill, I've been wondering what makes the Weasleys blood traitors exactly, but I do think, and maybe you guys can clear this up for me, that Bill's marriage to a half-Vila would certainly be something that would constitute being a traitor, in terms of diluting the blood. And that, so it's interesting because she has this high status because of her beauty. And then Harry's quick to remind us, to all of our annoyance, that Fleur is actually quite skilled as a wizard too, right? She is the Beauxbatons champion. And in the book that, those boys and girls, not just a girls' school, she, it's like a Hogwarts, and she obviously thinks it's better than Hogwarts because she's got that sort of attitude. But I think it's also interesting what you light on, Sarah, talking about how this book does really emphasize Ginny's additional wonderful attributes. And just two things about that is I've certainly found that when I'm identifying with something like my physical strength, or I think I like am dressed well or handsome someday, that when somebody walks in who's more handsome or bigger, I definitely revert to thinking in terms of other things like, oh, maybe I'm smarter than that well-dressed person, or I must have been spending some time studying while this person did this or that. I definitely sort of like Ginny will sort of light on my other positive attributes. But I think that's interesting that we get a much more full picture of Ginny because of that, because she's put in this uncomfortable, annoying position. And as you said, usually she is the pretty girl in the room. A lot of guys like her. at Hogwarts. And all of a sudden, like you said, this tin shows up and it's like, oh man, I got to look at myself a little differently. I need to highlight some other features of myself because I just can't win in this particular competition. I mean, look at the reaction of Harry and Ron. Harry's defending her. Ron can't even, Ron can't even keep his mouth closed. But we do find out, Ginny's an excellent chaser. She's very funny. She sees things in an interesting way. Harry actually longs for her company when he doesn't get it on the Hogwarts Express while he's feeling sort of lonely and taking his lumps again. We're returning to that theme of Harry gets isolated and still has moments of being as alone as he was on Privet Drive. When that summer when he didn't get any of his letters, when he has to confront Voldemort against Cedric, he's all alone there. He even tries to be all alone at the end of the last book, 5, but his friends finally sort of force themselves upon him. They say, no, this one we can all do together. But then he faces Voldemort alone again. But we get to see, like you were saying, Ginny's a great chaser. She's funny. She can do the bat bogey hacks. She can pull herself up by her own bootstraps. And I do think that that's really interesting when you connect it to, and I didn't notice this when I first read it, what is it that Harry smells when he goes by the Amordentia? I think the last thing is the smell of, I'm not going to get this exact right, but it's something like the shampoo that Ginny uses or her hair smell or something. There's a direct connection made between what Harry smells and the smell Ginny has, which is, I think, again, lighting up or agreeing with the theme you brought up, Sarah, that as these books mature, they become more about human relationships. And in particular, the most difficult relationship, which is that between, I think, man and woman and leading towards marriage. Because, well, just to say one thing about marriage, it's like it's an eternal relationship that is supposed to be guarded by God. And so it's like it's like taking an unbreakable vow. And I think part of what these books are trying to show us is just, like we saw with Harry and Cho in their really, really painful date, and then just how they went about interacting with each other in the last book. It's not so easy, that relationship. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of finesse, and it takes a lot of learning, I think, and also painful self-reflection. So I agree with everything you're saying, and I also think the connection to Merope Gaunt. One question, do you guys know who in classical mythology Merope is, or the most famous is? The name is used several times.
I do not. Is she a Gorgon or something?
You would think.
Isn't she like the adoptive mother of Oedipus?
Yes. Yes, she
Queen
is.
of Corinth?
Yes, the childless adopted or adopted mother of Oedipus. Yes, very much so. She is like the Egyptian princess to Moses. And she, yes, that is her name. And so it's interesting. I was mentioning that to my students. It's like tragedy follows that name, like how tragedy follows Eurydice. That's both Creon's wife who commits suicide and as well as you know, Orpheus's wife who dies on their marriage night. But I really like the connection to like the most beautiful girl, and then Merope, who's this eyes pointing in the wrong direction, sort of, really mistreated and spoken to in nasty ways and betrayed by her brother and, really berated by her father. I like that you make that connection, that we see just like those two very different sorts of lives and how one can be treated differently for whatever reasons they happen to be. In the course of life. I like that you notice the beauty and the ugliness like that.
I think I know that this is sort of skipping to the end of the reading assignment that we did, but the story of how Voldemort, Tom Riddle Jr., I guess, came to be, that at the very end of that chapter when Harry asks why the love potion stopped working, and Dumbledore sort of says, I don't know, but my sense is that she chose to stop giving him the potion, right? That
yes.
As in love with him as she was convinced that he would by now have fallen in love with her in return.
So sad.
I just had an enormous amount of pity for this young woman, a woman who is so, I think physically and verbally and emotionally abused by a sociopathic brother and a horrific father. And like, to me, you know, what fault is it of hers that she's just traumatized to the point of not being able to manifest her magical abilities, right? And then maybe also compounded by that is not knowing how and when to use them. It sounds like she didn't go to school, right? So like this,
Right.
all of these lessons that they're learning at Hogwarts about how and when to use magic, how and when to control their emotions, right? And to like maybe learn that there are ways in which you can and should use magic, and that there are some things that magic cannot and ought not address, right? Like they're learning all of these boundaries, and it seems like she's just so abused that, and like not taught that these boundaries aren't there for her, at least not consciously. Like she's just so swept up, and it seems just so real to me. Like, of course, this is, like you said, of course, this is where evil is born, right? But this is also a product of human evil, right? This isn't just like, this is a product of systems that have like how is it that the Ministry of Magic doesn't have a way to help people like Merope, right? Like they have a way to take her father and her brother away to Azkaban, but what do they do with this girl? And like, do they not have like child protective services within the Ministry of Magic? Like, clearly there are villains in this world. Like, what do you do with their children? And I mean, we'll learn a little bit about how Dumbledore tries, I guess, to deal with the products of this. But I don't know. That was one chapter where for me, the magic of it, like the wizarding world nature of it, was just ancillary. Like this was a real human, just as possible in the Muggle world as it is in the non-Muggle world to me. When I read it, it rang of like survivalists out in like the woods of these, in like super, you know, rural places that don't believe in school, and like, you know, get off my property or I'll, you know, pump your guts full of lead, or, you know, like I don't know. It seemed really real. I don't know what else you guys thought about that, or if you want to go back to Diagon Alley or something like that.
No, yeah, I kept thinking of like some Huck Finn stuff, you know, with his paw. That's the kind of fear that,
Yes.
you know, this what's his name, Marvolo seems to. Gosh, yeah, he's also. You asked about this a little bit ago, Alex. I think the blood traitor thing. He throws that at his own daughter, right? Like, and I
Right.
guess that would be sort of the most forceful sort of use of it, right? To somebody who you are related to. I don't remember now if Bellatrix calls Sirius that as well, but it's a similar kind of dynamic anyhow, of like, you know, relatives who have a falling out, and that's where you sort of get like the Greek style tragedy, right? Within the family, the thing that should have been so great, you know, falling, and that's like what makes the fall so great, or something like that, right? So, but I also thought that the disregard for the ministry was shocking to me. Like,
Yes.
that the people have like no conception of the ministry as an authority, right? They don't look at it in that way at all. And so it makes me wonder, like, you know, how many wizards are there out there that are like this, right? Like, how many sort of are doing their cyclopean thing out there in the hinterlands, and just how much is the ministry even in power? Is it all sort of a self-delusion within the magical world? It's almost like, as Muggles are to the magical world is to this larger older, more cantankerous world of, people who don't recognize their authority. It's fascinating. Yeah, I think this is one of the most interesting sort of insights into the reality of this world that has been conjured over 6 whole books, that we sort of see here. I think to the marriage point too, I wanted to bring up how Dumbledore never gets married, right? He never has an heir of his own. He wears a ring though on this crippled hand, and it's the ring that Harry notices in the memory. That's pretty bleak. I just wonder what you guys thought about Dumbledore's loneliness, how that's sort of being sketched in little by little.
I just have a question to append to after that, because I'll have to think on that. So I'm sorry, I might pass that to you, Sarah. But I also wanted to ask, just dealing with some of the painful moments in here, and just staying with Gaunt for a second. It's just that, what did y'all also think about the fact that you could be abused to such an extent that your powers would be repressed? I totally feel like that's true, and feel like I have some experience with that sort of thing. But also we see differing manifestations of that too. Like Neville also doesn't really fully develop, and maybe that's partially because he doesn't have a parent guiding him, or also the overly critical sort of view of him that his mom takes. He's not her son. Frank was so special, and Neville's sort of second rate in her mind. And also with Riddle, he sort of goes a different way. He doesn't have parents, and he's an orphan, and he sort of manifests these nasty and powerful powers. And somehow that comes from these Gaunts. And then there's Harry, who sort of mischievously makes things happen in the name of justice against evil Dudley. But the fact that, like, sort of how one is raised or how one's treated in the house can make a big difference about how one's powers manifest. And I do see a real tension between the family and the society, because, Albus Dumbledore left Harry with this terrible family. That said, the magic of that family, there's something, I think, being said there, that even bad families have a magic that society cannot touch. Even in the Gaunt family, which is so terrible, the Ministry only intervenes when something significant, even more significant than poor treatment of their child, like when they bleed into the Muggle world. And maybe that's a value judgment of theirs we want to question. But there does seem to be, and I think, Wes, you were sort of touching on this too, a magic to the family as well. And I think that's also why marriage is so significant and interesting, because it is bringing somebody into the family in a way that's far beyond words, even though you do it by oath. It's like a mixture of the blood in order to produce a child, or that's often what is consequent to it. And so, there's just this blood family aspect to that too. And so I see a tension there. I also wanted to ask about people's powers getting changed, but also Dumbledore's loneliness. What did you think about that, Sarah? It is true he never gets married, and there's McGonagall. She's pretty single too. And it's like, is it like a wisdom and the God the Father sort of thing, and they're hovering above the face of the deep, and that's Hogwarts and its infinite potential, or it's Lake with its squid in it? Or what?
This is a lot of questions. Wes, can you ask your question again? It was about, just if I'm not mistaken, it was about why does Dumbledore not marry but still wear a ring, particularly the Gaunt ring on his ill hand? Was that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, basically it seems like that ring is drawing attention to his singleness here. He's such a warm and loving figure, but he's all alone. I don't get it.
So I know we've talked, or at least Alex, you've mentioned it a number of times, the archetype of God the Father in Dumbledore, and seeing that a lot. And yes. I think a couple discussions ago I mentioned that I think at the end of the 5th book that what we're going to start to see, like, a weakened Dumbledore in terms of oh no, I'm sorry, our last discussion, in terms of his, increasing imminence, with Harry, like his increasing, dare I say, intimacy, inviting Harry into his office, into his thoughts, into his memories. He exposed himself as vulnerable by saying that he loved Harry. I think we're going to start to see him occupy a much more fatherly role. But yeah, I think it reminds me of one of the arguments. I'm not saying I buy this argument, by the way, but it's one of the arguments that's made for priests not having a family. That to do well, and I don't know if this is not one of the theologically rooted arguments, at least not as far as I can tell, but just almost from a practical standpoint, that to be a good shepherd, you need to attend to all of the sheep. To be a good pastor means to be attentive to the flock. And that, there's some question, I think, as to how well you can do that when you have your own family to attend to, right? Like you said, like a tension between, serving the good of the family, almost placing the family prior to the state, right? Like Antigone style, right. That's the unit, and families make up the state, but families prior. And especially when you consider that family is sort of this biological impulse to basically create a copy of yourself and have your name live on, your blood. There are evolutionary impulses to procreation, to family, right? And that to give that up, right, or to resist that urge, that programmed desire for a copy of yourself, for a legacy that's embodied, that's not just a legacy of ideas or inventions or whatever, but that is a real sacrifice, and then it also maybe for Dumbledore, I don't know so much about Minerva McGonagall, but for Dumbledore, maybe it's the thing that allows him to do the other good work that will form a legacy for him, I guess. I think the thing about the ring is interesting just because I think I've been to enough weddings where you hear this ring is a symbol of my love and affection, or my love and fidelity, right? That the ring is supposed to be symbolic of this vow that you make, this oath of fidelity, of commitment, of affection, and that it's supposed to, I think, remind the world, but also remind you as you wear it of, say, an oath that you've taken, sacrifices that you have either made in the past, are currently making, or intend to, or are willing to make in the future. To me, Dumbledore choosing to wear the Gaunt ring, I don't know that for today we've read all the way through where this is sort of revealed, but I do get the sense that he has Dumbledore has some sense of responsibility, misplaced or not, for what has happened, or what happens to Tom Riddle. On the one hand, totally not his fault. Tom Riddle makes a series of poor choices of his own accord, and we can already see when we meet him as a kid, that kid's a little messed up to begin with, right? But all right, and I know we haven't gotten there yet, but that kid's not normal. But he also is a part of his life, and I can see there being a kind of choosing to wear this ring that's a representation of a sacrifice that he's made, a commitment that he has made maybe to the world, but also a reminder of one's own fragility, a reminder of one's own weakness, being that it's on his cursed hands. I don't know, that seems like I can see why he wears it, right? It reminds him of maybe that he's not as sharp, or not as quick as he once was, but that this is the legacy that he has chosen, and that like as tempting as it might be to say, oh, I don't have all the answers, I'm going to die soon anyway, that like he has to use whatever time he has left on this earth to shore up that legacy, I guess. That's sort of how I read it. I don't remember what your other question was, Alex, honestly.
I agree. I want to just address that because I think it's good. I do note that it's the ring is on his wand arm, which is his right arm. So it's not on his left hand, but it's interesting because it mixes a few symbols. So if we take Dumbledore as in some way embodying the God, the Father archetype, then part of that archetype related to, say, the Horus and Osiris myth and the Lion King is that protective father has to die at some point. And I think that's part of what you see in the New Testament as well, that which protects you from knowledge of your own vulnerability and keeps you within its own house must die so that you can yourself become that figure and embody it and become the next father generation as hero. Harry's going to have to learn from this figure because now he's shown his vulnerability, the mortality of that symbol in the world insofar as mortals have to embody it, because Dumbledore is a mortal after all, even if I see him as embodying the archetype of God the Father. But if Harry's going to take that next step into adulthood, which I think is a heroic step, he's going to have to recognize that Dumbledore can't solve all the problems. Isn't the fountain of all wisdom. Obviously, he has a tremendous amount. He's cleverer than most others, he permits himself to say. And he can do things with a wand, we learned in the last book, that have never been seen by a doddering old examiner who's ostensibly seen everything. And so Harry's got to become that. I do see it as part of that. I also think it's really interesting, Sarah, how you mentioned sort of the idea of the priesthood tending to the whole flock, and even just being a teacher, I feel very much like that. And I just note that these teachers are very much like parents to these kids. They literally live with them, and then they join together in this blood-like way. It's some middle ground, this fraternity sorority house system. And they live with them for, like 7 years, months at a time. And you don't see a lot of them having relationships either outside of the household. And, just knowing some data and knowing the beat, it can be hard for teachers to maintain that balance because it's not as clear cut as perhaps with other professions, where the family and not family line exactly is. And so
Absolutely.
it's almost like what Harry needs to start learning is how to provide that now, rather than to be simply the recipient of that. And that's part of why I think he sees Dumbledore both as vulnerable and potentially not always acting in the right way, in the most moral or ethical way, making mistakes, and will, eventually even have to see something far more significant, even than.
I was just gonna say, if I could just jump in, I think the place where he gets to learn some of this, like the lab, is the Quidditch pitch. Like being the captain of the team will involve making certain decisions in terms of who gets to be on your team, but also once that, I know we didn't read the Felix Felicis chapter yet, but the strategies that Harry starts to employ are not that different from the strategies that Dumbledore employs, right? Maybe, and we can talk about this when we read it, but if he's looking at Dumbledore as kind of the model that he's going to have to start to emulate, and as one decreases, the other one increases.
Right.
Yeah, like that. It's interesting to draw some kind of much lower stakes parallels. I think the other thing that I don't remember this from the book or from the movie, but that struck me about their first lesson, right, was when Dumbledore says something to the effect of like, now we're venturing, I could be very wrong about all of this, right? Like, we're venturing into a world where like the answers are a little less clear and I could be very wrong, but I'm just going to give you all of these memories. And it reminded me of two things. One, how important history is, and understanding history. I didn't do the history segment at St. John's because of the number of pages I would have had to read. But it made me think, like, I never really understood why that was a segment unto itself. But how important it is to stay understanding a lot of the other things. But the other thing that it reminded me of is, like, Dumbledore is so good that his instincts that he's not sure of are right? Like,
right.
He is so, like, he is to the point of wisdom, of understanding, of, you know, his instincts have been honed for so long in so many ways. Like, he's got all of the skills, he's got tons of experience and knowledge, right? That he can sort of fill in the blank in the right direction in a way that, like, filling in that blank, you know, like creating something, that's like being a jazz musician, but like that, you know, that's like, there's this thing in Dubliners, James Joyce talks about it. He one of his first images is of the gnomon, which is like a piece on a sundial, and it's like the L-shaped piece, and the gnomon is the part of the parallelogram that's been cut out, I think, and that from looking at the shape that's been cut into, you can, if you look the right way, you can fill in the shape, but you have to know kind of sort of what you're looking for. That he knows enough, and he looks enough. He looks in the right ways that he's getting at the right things, I guess. That to me is just remarkable. I'm sure I will never be smart enough to be able to do that. That's magic to me.
Well, we can all try together. It's like he's Socrates in the Timaeus giving a likely account of what's happening, or Newton on meteors. If you get that really nice edition, I can picture the book, but I can't bring the publisher to mind, that has the extended introduction that was popular when we were at St. John's. It talks about what conclusions of Newton's he speculated on that have now been proved true. And there are several, and part of them are his theory on comets, which, you know, it's hard to even see that. Yeah, what do you think about this Dumbledore-Harry dynamic, Wes? And maybe we don't need to return to the powers question, or maybe it'll just come up at some point.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that does seem to be kind of at the bottom of it, though, right? Like, if Dumbledore in some sense messed up with Tom Riddle, he seems to have really gotten it right with Harry in most respects, because he does place Harry within a family which, while they're not obviously particularly loving or something, they are the sort of family who makes Harry who he is, right? And that's a pretty remarkable person. It's that contrast again with Diddykins, right? Like, at least you haven't made him into that soft creature sitting between the two of you, right? Like, on the couch, which is, so the contrasts, I think, are becoming so like prevalent here. They're brought out in such relief. It's really excellent, I think, to think then about these characters that we've sort of grown to know so well, by kind of juxtaposing them in different ways, by seeing, in this case, Harry growing into the stature of the chosen one, right? Kind of gives us a better sense than in hindsight of all of the developments up to that point, and what a hand Dumbledore had in all of that, right? He some way is kind of the author of Harry Potter. On the other hand, so is Voldemort, right? By his deciding that was the one that the prophecy must have spoken about, right? So yeah, the sense of like this kind of informal education going on throughout the whole series and reaching back into history is brought out really nicely here to be in tension with the formal education, which is getting so intense. They're doing spells without speaking now, which we've been really interested in. I think like the role of speech and language and magic. So now Snape's like, well, okay, just do it without saying anything. go try it. All right. And then let's see. The other thing is the potions, which are so awesome. Such a great teaching strategy, I think, to sort of dangle that prize in front of the kids on the first day. Like, let's see who's like really, really ready to shine in this class. You get like the price.
It's a controlled substance, right? He's like giving them a drug if you do really well.
What a cool teacher.
He does tell them to use it
teacher's
right.
Teacher's gonna get fired.
Yeah, well, as we know with these new teachers, they often are pretty come and go. And he's sort of like the stereotypical like old charismatic teacher who doesn't care anymore. He's just going to do what he does. But I think it's also a very Slytherin thing that he's doing too, right? It's like he gives it to him with a wink and a nod. And he's like, all right, old boy, have at it. Have a good old time. And so perhaps there is something perfidious in it, but I do agree that that's a good strategy to dangle a prize in front of the students, and that, getting them to feel that sense of awe just to add, that will then add to their earnestness. And just to add to your informal education part, Harry performs better than ever at potions by learning from this so-called half-blood prince, who could be, I don't know, Harry, Voldemort at this point, or somebody else we don't know, but somebody who's definitely very gifted at potions and dark arts, it sounds like. And it's also interesting just because that is so like our education. Like at St. John's, we would always be sort of doing extra reading groups or trying to meet with tutors extra, trying to get additional informal education. And what's interesting too is just that how much that contrasts with what Umbridge tried to produce at Hogwarts, that the teachers need to stay within very strict boundaries, and that seems to get the opposite effect from what you might want. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like, yeah, Umbridge is mentioned here. She's clearly still there as a kind of extreme. And I like, how Slughorn, the prize is partly the potion, but again, yeah, like you say, the prize is also partly like his admiration. He makes such a tool of it and wields it so, artfully to bedazzle everyone and, pit them against one another. And so when he like gathers them into his compartment and, feeds them and puffs up their egos in various ways, I found that so interesting. Like that, that's his entree into the world of Hogwarts, right? Is to immediately gather his slug club together and start like figuring out and poking and prodding, like who do I need to like attach myself to here. I like also the way that Harry, goes off and sort of eavesdrops a number of times so far in this book, is a weird sense in which his like childishness is still hanging on, and he really gets burned for it in the train. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the entire time while I was reading the chapter on the Slug Club, I just couldn't stop thinking of Slughorn as like this this mountainous, like overwhelmingly fat man, right? Like,
he is like a walrus, right?
Yes, I keep thinking of that one U.S. president whose name I never can remember, but who was super, super fat.
He
I
needed
think,
two tubs put together. I think it was tap.
yeah.
I could be wrong.
Well, I think
but-
tap sounds right. But anyway, our conversation from last week definitely affected how I read this. I think one thing that struck me as funny, not funny, but like interesting, when we're talking about like blood and half-blood and blood traitor, right? And Harry's so open to using the book, and it becomes a book, like it becomes like bedside reading, you know, like he's reading a textbook.
Right.
At some point, Ron makes a joke about it, right? Like that behavior is obscene in anybody besides Hermione. But like, but that it is kind of cutting a corner, right? To get something that you want, and to me, that's like a very Slytherin move, right? He's not playing by the same rules as everybody else, and he's totally okay with that. I mean, he tries to eventually like help Ron, but I mean, Hermione wants to play by the rules, right? To compete on a fair a fair playing field. And I just think it's like an interesting touch point between Gryffindor and Slytherin, these two houses that are like often set as polar opposites. But this is a moment where like the impulse to win and the impulse to win at all costs, or whatever it takes, maybe to step on other people to get there. Like, I think you could see it in either house, right? Like Slughorn using competition to breed excellence is a highly effective classroom strategy, right? To provide like a little carrot at the end. And maybe the carrot is just my words of praise, but in this case, it's also like a little treat. And gosh, like that appeals to the impulse for games, right? The competitive spirit, the boldness of Gryffindor, as well as the ambition of Slytherin. I thought that was super interesting. The other thing I will say is I think it's interesting how even though Slughorn is so obsessed with like famous people and having connections and all that, he's also willing to start inviting people who don't have the name but who have like some demonstrated talent, right? Like he's not completely, he does still sort of see the world as like you're either in or you're out, you're like cool or you're not cool, you're like invited or you're on the outside looking in. But that door is not purely about pure blood. It's not only like he's genuinely impressed by Hermione, even though she is a Muggle born, right? I thought that made me hate him or dislike him a little less. I don't know.
He does seem to give people a fair shake. Wes, did you see Harry's following those directions in a Slytherin sort of light, or did you take it like Ron did, that he also followed directions, just other directions? He took a risk, and it panned out.
Yeah, it's interesting how Ron stands up for Harry here, because he could very easily, be jealous, like we've seen him in the past, or even when we see Hermione like thank Harry for calling her the smartest one in the class or whatever, like Ron gets a little jealous there. It seems like his locus of jealousy is narrowed or something like that, right? But instead he really stands up for Harry there, and is pretty much super duper loyal so far. And I think the way that the book is like a hindrance at first to Harry, it's like he's trying to read, but there's all this scribbling all over it, right? That I found so interesting. Like, yeah, he really is trying to do it without following the instructions that have been overlaid, but it's like he can't. It's like it's too in the way or something, and he's like, he really wants that dang prize too. So, gosh, yeah, I don't know. It is a bit Slytherin-ish, but it's also like fate has clearly thrown this in his path, and if nothing else, he's a creature of fate at this point, right? He's the chosen one. That's the thing that he seems to be really asked to struggle with here, and like sort of make sense of however he can. So yeah, everyone keeps looking at him. It's like we're back to year one all over again.
And again, because of a brush with Voldemort. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Well, there's one thing I just wanted to ask about before we sign off today, which is, what did y'all think about Snape becoming the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and it also being referred to as DADA, like Dumbledore's army at one point, and just also about, like you were saying earlier, Wes, the fact that they now have to use their minds alone. And it's funny because if you remember the original speech Snape gives in the year one, he talks about there not being silly wand waving and speaking in his class, and that you sort of have to brew. And so it's interesting that, again, he makes this subject more cerebral than it otherwise would be. He can get into those higher realms that some people can't. He's so gifted. And I think we have been seeing a lot of Snape's gifts recently, like we were talking about with his capacity for legitimacy and occlumency, but also that he can guide them into this. Whereas Dumbledore is now guiding Harry into more speculative realms, again, harder to see things. So now is Snape doing that with Harry and the kids, and even McGonagall too. Just to add to that, now Harry said now he understands only half of what she says, yeah, I think I had another question that I wanted to add to that, but yeah, why don't I just end on that, because I've already said so much.
Well, I think the way that Snape talks about the dark arts is really interesting, and how I think it's Hermione who points out that that's the way that Harry talks about battling Voldemort, right? These kind of like ultimate challenges that push the limits of what's possible and maybe of what's worth doing or should be done, right, in any kind of moral or like ethical sense. So I found that connection really, really interesting, particularly then when the next thing that happens is like we see him basically attack Harry Potter because I don't know, he wants to like show off, I guess. That again is like, there's that childish side to Snape, and I think that there's something kind of curious about how those two elements, right, the ultimate limits of like pushing knowledge, but also this like kind of reversion, those two things do seem to go hand in hand, and it's like, as far as you can push outward, you're also like pushing back inward to figure out like what makes you tick, like what makes you these dumb things, but you do them, and it's like that's who you are in some sense. It's great. Yeah, I love that little confrontation, detention.
I actually saw. Yeah, go on, Sarah.
Oh no, I was just going to say that moment when Hermione points out, like, actually, I thought he sounded a lot like you, and Harry's like horrified at the prospect, right? He's like offended that I think he doesn't talk to her for the rest of the day. Is that right? I guess I might be mixing things up because I'm a little bit further ahead, but he's offended that she would equate in any way those two, right? And yet, like, Wes, you mentioned the contrasts that are starting to sort of emerge. I'm also starting to see like some parallels, right? Like between characters that you didn't think, that I guess I wouldn't necessarily put them on parallel tracks, but Harry's not the only one who's been chosen for something, right? He's like chosen for a mission. And the way that he and Draco talk about it is different, right? And certainly their missions are different, but they're kind of they both really want that, the liquid luck. They both need help. I don't know. I think that that's also starting to emerge, that like some of the characters are complexified, right? By just a little tiny glimpse into their humanity, right? You would think like, oh my God, the mother of Voldemort, what a witch she's got to be, no pun intended, right? But like, she's just a victim, right? She's just sad. And yeah, I think that that's sort of what I also see starting to emerge. As much as you start to really tease out like these important foils, I think they also start to kind of move almost inexorably on this track together towards one another, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like things are finally getting serious, and definitely that tension and that parallel between Draco and Harry as like a negative and positive chosen ones is there. And also, like you were saying, things are more complex in that Snape is also a chosen one too, right? Both by Voldemort and by Albus Dumbledore. And it's sort of an open question who he truly serves. You know, I mean, Harry suspects him, but we know that that's sort of self-serving, and that seems to be also what delegitimizes his legitimate observations about the weird behavior of Draco. But also people think he has potentially a prejudiced perspective towards him because they just dislike each other so much. So he would want to see that. But yeah, okay, well, you all, so you said you're ahead, Sarah, and we're not going to be able to do this until I think 2 weeks from now. So do we want to read a healthy chunk for this upcoming bit?
I'm sorry, what's next week? Did I miss that?
Next week is, well, I'll be in Fiji. I have Easter break.
Oh, damn.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
I know.
Okay.
It's going to be the first time I've ever gone somewhere where the water is clear. And man, I'm going to come back a new man.
Speaking of next week, Wes, I saw that I missed that. Maybe you sent a message over the Slack channel. I'm sorry, I did not get that notification. But maybe we should chat about what we're gonna do.
Yeah, we'll have to do that before Alex goes to Fiji, because we need your input too, Alex. Like,
okay,
absolutely. What should we do at their panel? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can enjoy your time.
Yeah, no, I want to help, and I'm sorry I didn't. I'm not making it up there, but well, you know, we just have to keep doing more of these, and I'll definitely be there. Because I want to do a live show, and I want to see y'all. I think that'd be great. As good as this is, it'd be funny to see while we talk.
Yeah, it would. Question, totally unrelated. Did you guys see the picture of the black hole?
Yes.
Yeah.
From how freaking cool is that? That is so cool.
That is some profound coolness right there.
I agree in concept, but I thought it was funny. Barstool Sports posted an article that said it was the worst, that like new black hole scene, worst photo of all time. As cool as it is, like it's definitely not like an awesome high resolution picture. I know everybody will hate on me for that. I mean, I was amazed first, but then I laughed at that joke second. But I posted a picture of that on the History of Western Thought too, with a Nietzsche quote about if you stare in the abyss.
Stare at the abyss.
Yeah, exactly.
The abyss stares back.
Yeah. Best if you fight against monsters, not to become a monster. Maybe that's what we're going to see with Harry here. And yeah, so many interesting parallels. I can't wait to talk more about this in a couple of weeks and to talk about the upcoming conference. And so which chapter do we want to go to? Do we want to go through Christmas, 16? Do we want a sluggish memory, 17? I can really do as much as possible. I think I'm going to be listening to a lot of this on the plane.
Yeah, I maybe, is that the next memory that we get, the sluggish memory? Maybe we should end on that one, since we ended on the Gaunt memory.
It's not the next memory, but it is the third memory, or it's the third memory chapter. So yeah, let's go through chapter 17, the sluggish memory. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, bottoms up, y'all.
Cheers.
Later.
Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye.
Safe travels.